everyone. It's Kim from the Pennington Public Library. Welcome. We're glad you're joining us tonight for The Great Silence of Lichens, a collaboration with the Sauerland Conservancy and part of our 2026 Beyond the Page Community Read Initiative. Now, usually we walk right past these quiet crusts on rocks and trees without a second thought. But tonight, we're going to slow down and look at them as powerful indicators of intelligence, communication, and the ecological changes occurring right under our noses. Before we dive in, a quick note on how to participate. Please place any questions for our speaker, Dennis, in the Q&A window. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk. But also feel free to share your thoughts or observations in the chat throughout the talk. Now, to get us started, I'd like to introduce Laurie Cleveland. Laurie is the Executive Director of the Sauerland Conservancy, and she's going to say a few words. Laurie, welcome. The floor is yours, Laurie.
Thank you, Kim. And welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for The Great Science of Lichens, Biology, Ecology, and Listening with Dennis Waters. As Kim said, I'm Laurie Cleveland, Executive Director of the Sauerland Conservancy. If you're not familiar with the Conservancy, we're a tiny but mighty nonprofit organization. Our mission is to protect, promote, and preserve the unique character of the 90 square mile Sauerland Mountain region, which hosts New Jersey's largest forest. It's just north of Pennington. More than 800,000 residents of New Jersey and Pennsylvania rely on the Sauerlands for some or all of their clean drinking water, but unfortunately, over the past 5 years, more than 1 million trees have died in our region. And that loss impacts the forest's ability to reduce stormwater, filter our air and water, sequester carbon, and provide habitat for wildlife. The good news is there's something each of us can do to help, whether it's planting native plants at home or rolling up your sleeves and planting with us. The Sauerland Conservancy has been working with volunteers, corporate groups, partner organizations, municipalities to plant more than 65,000 native trees and shrubs. If you'd like to learn how you can help, please visit our website or reach out to info@sauerland.com. Thank you, Kim and the Pennington Public Library for collaborating with us on this presentation and for helping us spread the word.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Now it's my time to introduce our speaker, Dennis Waters. A little bit about Dennis. Dennis is a true polymath, a scientist, historian, author, and retired entrepreneur. He is currently a visiting scientist at Rutgers University, where he focuses his research on the lichens of central New Jersey. His deep roots in our community include serving as the township historian for Lawrence Township and chairing the endowment committee of the Philadelphia Botanical Club. Tonight, he'll be taking us on a unique journey through lichen biology and ecology, framed by the lens of Ted Chiang's acclaimed short story, The Great Silence. Whether you're a science buff or a literature lover, there's so much to uncover here. Please join me in welcoming Dennis Waters. Dennis, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Laurie. It's absolutely great to be here. I'm going to endeavor to share my screen, and we'll see if we can get started. Hopefully, everyone can see this. So, as Kim has mentioned, and many of you know, this talk is part of the Beyond the Page project at the Pennington Public Library. The book this year is Ted Chiang's collection of short stories, Exhalation. And the focus tonight is on the story, The Great Silence. And in this story, the reader is addressed by a parrot, and not just any parrot, a Puerto Rican parrot, which is a critically endangered species, red-listed internationally. The parrot has much to say on behalf of its species, but a great deal of the story centers on the parrot's neighbor in the Puerto Rican jungle, which is the Arecibo Space Telescope, an enormous astronomical instrument built into the mountaintops of the Puerto Rican Cordillera. I should note that I do have a slight personal connection with the Arecibo Telescope, as I've been there. Here's a family vacation photo I took about 20 years ago. As the parrots point out, one goal of the Arecibo radio telescope is to listen to the cosmos. It's a giant ear designed to pick up communications from deep space in case there might be some alien intelligence out there that is emitting such a communication. The fact that the Arecibo scope has heard nothing helps to give our story its title, The Great Silence. If they are out there, why have we not heard anything? And this great silence raises a different question for the parrot. Why do humans spend so much time and treasure looking away from Earth when we readily overlook creatures right here on our planet that have plenty to say to us? Parrots, for example. But this evening, we are not here to talk about overlooked parrots. We are here to talk about overlooked lichens, which in their own way also have plenty to say to us. Lichens are all around us, whether we overlook them or not. Anytime you find yourself out of doors in the daylight, you almost certainly will be able to see some surface that has a lichen living on it. Could be a tree trunk, or the ground, or a rock, or a wall, or a parking lot, or a picnic table. If you look closely, you will probably see a lichen. But as the parrot tells us, for the most part, we don't look very closely. We're too busy looking up to look down. So reading Ted Chiang's story made me look more closely at parrots, and I hope that over the next few minutes, you will give lichens more attention than usual. And while the story of the Arecibo telescope involves deep space, the farthest reaches of the universe, tonight's story of lichens begins in deep time, in the earliest days of multicellular life on Earth. A few months ago, scientists described finding a fossilized lichen that was 400 million years old. Here's the fossil in question. All I can say is we're lucky that there are scientists who can figure out that lichen. This ancient lichen dates back to the time when the first living things began to emerge from their happy homes in the ocean to the dangerous and terrifying challenge of life on land. I'm not going to suggest that lichens came out of the water, like the proverbial fish that grows legs and crawls onto the beach. Rather, for reasons that I will discuss shortly, lichens can be impressively resilient. This resilience makes them good candidates for colonizing the terrestrial world, which in those early days was not a hospitable place. One reason we know this about lichens is that there are plenty of spots in our world and our universe that are still not so hospitable. Certainly, if we follow the lead of the Arecibo telescope and look away from Earth, it gets inhospitable pretty quickly. And so was born an experiment. What would happen if we took a lichen into space? The lichen in question is this orange one in the Xanthoria group. The name Xanthoria is from the Greek xantho, meaning yellow or golden. And this particular lichen is commonly found on rocks along the seaside. It's happiest in the midst of bird poop. So without any astronaut training, off went the Xanthoria lichen to the International Space Station, where it was placed in a little container just outside of the space station, without so much as a spacesuit. And how long did it remain outside the space station? The answer is 18 months. A year and a half of just hanging out with no protection and no sustenance. And when scientists finally brought it back indoors to see how it was doing, they found that 3/4 of the lichen was still alive. This has led to speculation that if anything on Earth could survive on Mars, it would probably be a lichen. We also know this because lichens thrive in the most challenging habitats right here on Earth. Here we have an alpine habitat, high in the mountains above the tree line. Here's a rocky coastline exposed to salt spray with our astronaut Xanthoria. Here's Antarctica. Here's the dry Sonoran Desert. And here's some frozen tundra high above the Arctic Circle. Now, what do all of these habitats have in common? Well, they're all extreme and unforgiving, very cold, very hot, very dry, very salty, very exposed. Few, if any, species of flowering plants can survive in any of them. Yet in all of these habitats, you will find successful, thriving communities of lichens. And like the parrots, lichens have something to say to us if we're willing to listen. Whether you're climbing up a mountain or moving toward higher and higher latitudes, north or south, as the conditions become harsher and harsher and all other kinds of plant life drop away, you will eventually be left with only lichens. Why is this? I'll answer that question in a few minutes, but first I need to contradict myself. Get started on that early. And that's because there exist lichens that are less like robust space travelers and more like the parrots of Puerto Rico, rare, endangered, and sensitive to habitat disturbance. And again, lichens have something to say to us if we're willing to listen. This is because lichens absorb everything they need, all of their nutrition, directly from the air around them. They're not plants. Well, they're not entirely plants. They have no roots to gather nutrients underground. And as you can imagine, an organism that takes in everything directly from the air naturally reflects the quality of that air. And in cases where the air suffers, the lichens suffer too. While some lichens are resilient, many species cannot survive in dirty air, especially high levels of sulfur dioxide, which comes from burning coal. The result is often fewer lichens, less diversity, and the total absence of species that are most sensitive. As a result, environmental scientists have adopted lichens as what are called bioindicators, passive, naturally occurring monitors of air quality. In some cases, population levels of particularly sensitive species can be a measure, and in other cases, it's the overall diversity of lichen species that is the metric. As an example, for many years, the U.S. Forest Service has had an ongoing monitoring program using lichens with hundreds of sites that are regularly sampled. This map shows the location of lichen sampling in the eastern U.S. And locally, there was a biodiversity inventory of the lichens down in the Abbott marshlands, the area between Trenton and Bordentown. Until recently, this important wetland habitat was a few miles downwind of the Mercer generating station. You can see the stacks right here. That was a huge coal-fired PSE&G power plant that for many years was the largest point source of sulfur dioxide in New Jersey. And I guess that's saying something. The plant was shut down a few years ago, and it is hoped that the area can be studied long-term to see whether and how the lichen community will rebound as the air quality improves. If lichens are a useful measure of air quality, you should not find it surprising to learn that they are also indicators of forest quality. The size and diversity of the lichen population can give you a good idea of whether a forest is thriving. There's even a correlation between the health of pristine old-growth forests and particular lichen species that will grow nowhere else. These lichens know the good neighborhoods. In northeastern North America, one lichen that stands out in this regard is what is called the lungwort, Loberia pulmonaria. If you see this big, beautiful lichen growing on a tree, you can be sure you are in a forest that is in good health. In New Jersey, this lichen has only been seen once since 1941. So we've seen that lichens are everywhere, that some are robust enough to survive for long stretches in outer space, while others are so exquisitely sensitive that so much as a whiff of sulfur dioxide or anything but the most pristine habitat causes them to swoon. The question you may be asking yourself is why? The answer is that lichens are not a single organism like a parrot. Rather, they are a partnership, a symbiosis in which each partner helps to take care of the other. One partner is a fungus, though not literally a mushroom. The fungus is the dominant partner. So when scientists assign official species names to lichens, it's always the name of the fungus. Technically, scientists don't even call them lichens anymore. The preferred term is lichenized fungi. There are more than 20,000 species of fungus that have joined the lichen club. That's about 20% of the named species of fungi. So the lichenized lifestyle is common. The other partner in the relationship is an organism that photosynthesizes, that can turn sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into sugar. When we think of photosynthetic organisms, we usually think of green plants, and for most lichens, a microscopic green plant is the partner. But there are other critters that photosynthesize that are not green plants. Some of these are called cyanobacteria, and there are lichens that partner with cyanobacteria rather than green plants. So you start with a fungus, partner it with something that photosynthesizes, and that gives you a lichen. Of course, in science, things are rarely that simple. Often there are lots of bacteria and other fungi that are hanging around and making a contribution, but for our purposes tonight, the simple two-member partnership will be sufficient. So how does this partnership work? The first point is that this is not a voluntary partnership. It's not like one day some fungus swiped right on some green plant and they decided to hook up. It's what scientists call an obligate relationship, meaning the partners have no choice. They're obliged to pair off as a lichen. They've been living together for so many thousands of generations that they're now incapable of living independently. The second point is that it's not necessarily even an equal partnership. The green half is physically held captive within the fungus. That's where it lives. Here, the fungus has the plant cells in a prison, cells in cells. This relationship has been compared to agriculture. The fungus is cultivating something green in order to provide itself with food. And how is this different from humans with our corn and our soybeans? Well, one way it's different is that we don't grow corn and soybeans inside our bodies. So that's one half of the partnership. The green half provides sugar for the fungus. Nothing beats a reliable supply of food in a hostile and unpredictable world. But what does the fungus provide? The short answer is protection. Nice sugar you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. Left to its own devices, the green partner would face the risk of drying out, of being scorched by solar radiation, of being exposed to chemicals in the air, and even of being scarfed up by some animal looking for a tasty and nutritious meal. Better to stay inside the fungus where it's safe and predictable. In many cases, the fungus can manufacture chemicals that act as sunscreen for its green partner, or discourage browsing by hungry herbivores. These chemicals are one reason that some lichens can survive in outer space and other hostile and dangerous environments. Lichens manufacture about 900 chemical compounds that are found nowhere else in nature, and these chemicals are of great interest to the pharmaceutical industry, among others. So what else does this partnership do? The parrots would ask, what is its role in the environment? Or as humans might ask, what's in it for us? Lichens provide a lot of what scientists call ecosystem services, activities that contribute to the health of the environment. For one thing, because they are just about everywhere, lichens are significant carbon sinks, taking carbon dioxide from the air and storing it for long periods of time. Some are also able to fix nitrogen, and some can absorb and sequester heavy metals from the air. Lichens that live on rocks are primary soil producers. Much of the soil you find on local landforms like Sourland or Baldpate Mountains and Mount Rose is the result of lichens breaking down trap rock over millions of years. Lichens are also a food source for various critters, although generally not animals our size. The exception to this is found above the Arctic Circle, where reindeer survive the winter by pawing through the snow to feed on the abundant lichen ground cover. But to return to the Hopewell Valley, we'll have a look at some of the local lichen groups that you are probably overlooking in your everyday life. And this is based on work done a few years ago with the help of the Mercer County Parks Commission and DNR Greenway. About 175 species of lichen were found across the county, including down on the coastal plain. We won't look at all of them tonight, but I'd like to highlight a few of the common groups so that perhaps you will not overlook them in the future. This review is based on what was found at these collecting sites in Hopewell Township, including Sauerland Mountain, Baldpate Mountain, Mount Rose and St. Michael's, and Mercer Meadows. So how can you tell one lichen from another? If you're not paying attention, they do tend to look similar, maybe as green patches on trees or gray stains on rocks. But in fact, all of the 100 or so species in the Hopewell Valley are different, often in ways that can be understood without a lot of training. So let's take a look. These 5 points summarize how we tell one lichen from another. The first 3 questions can be answered out in the woods by just about anyone. The other 2 may require a little more training and study. Since lichens live on surfaces, the first thing we want to know is what kind of surface, which is what lichenologists call the substrate. Second, we want to know something about the overall shape of the lichen, what we call its growth form. And finally, we want to know what reproductive structures are visible. These can usually be seen with the naked eye or a simple magnifying glass. Then we want to look at the morphology, which includes some easy to see things like color and size, but also includes questions like where on the lichen the reproductive structures are located or details of how the lichen is attached to its substrate. Finally, we take the lichen specimen back to the lab to study things that can only be seen through the microscope, like the spores of the fungus, or to figure out what weird chemicals the lichen produces. So we'll start by taking a little closer look at the first question. In the Hopewell Valley, most lichens are found growing on trunks or branches of trees or on rocks. We have 2 major rock types locally. One is the gray trap rock diabase that makes up the boulders found on top of Sauerland Mountain or Mount Rose. The other rocks are the red and gray shales that are found along stream channels like Stony Brook. We also have lichens that grow on soil or on bare wood, either something weathered like a fence rail or something decaying like a fallen log. Some lichens will have a distinct preference for one substrate. Others seem not to care too much. To tell lichens apart, the second question asks about growth form. There are 3 main growth forms: foliose, fruticose, and crustose. Foliose lichens have a leaf-like appearance with upper and lower surfaces, but they're mostly flat. Fruticose lichens aren't flat at all, but have a third dimension, looking more tree-like. And crustose lichens look almost like they've been spray painted onto their substrate. The most common and in-your-face growth form that you're likely to notice is foliose. Most of the large, flat lichens you find growing on bark are foliose, which means leaf-like. They have a distinct upper and lower surfaces so that you could remove them from the bark without disturbing the bark too much. When you see a big greenish or grayish patch on a tree, you're probably seeing a foliose lichen. Next, there is fruticose. These lichens are more three-dimensional, looking like little trees or shrubs. They can grow straight up from the ground or bush out from a tree. The common group around here are the cladonias, which can often be found growing on rotting logs or in patches of moss. And then finally, we have crustose lichens, which, as I mentioned, look sort of like they've been spray painted onto their substrate. They have no lower surface as such. You would be hard-pressed to remove one from a tree or a boulder without taking a chunk of bark or rock with it. They are the largest and most diverse group in our area, but also the easiest to overlook. And now we come to the third question: how does a lichen reproduce? If you ever stop to think about the problem of lichen reproduction, which I suspect you haven't, you would immediately see one big issue. The lichen is a composite organism made up of 2 partners, so reproduction becomes double the trouble. Both partners are needed to start a new lichen, but how do you get them to synchronize their reproduction so both can get out there into the world? Lichens have discovered 2 solutions to this problem. One is to reproduce sexually by launching spores into the environment just like any other fungus. The problem here is that the spore represents only one half of the organism, the fungal half. The photosynthetic partner is not part of the process. How can a symbiosis reproduce with only one partner? I can tell you that, frankly, lichenologists do not know exactly how this happens, but it obviously does happen. Lichens do reproduce this way. The spores are propelled out into the world, and somehow some of them manage to find a scrap of exactly the green partner they're looking for to create a new lichen. However, the evidence is mounting that species by species over geologic timescales, lichens are giving up on sex. Asking the spore to go find its green partner is too inefficient. It's a big ask. It would be so much more efficient if the fungus and its partner could propagate together, and so many lichens have figured out how to do that by packaging up a little bit of each and reproducing asexually by cloning themselves. We'll talk first about sexual reproduction. Lichen spores are produced in specialized organs. Most lichens that reproduce sexually produce their spores in a structure called an apothecium, which is an easily observed feature of a lichen. And a minority of lichens produce their spores in a structure called a perithecium. So up here and here and here we have apothecia, and up here this one uses perithecia. So differences among spores, apothecia, and perithecia are very important in lichen identification. And how often telling one species from another depends on the size, shape, or cellular configuration of spores, and that's work that requires a microscope and more time than we have here tonight. But before we talk about asexual reproduction, I should first point out that any fragment of a lichen, if it contains some fungal tissue and some of the green partner, can grow into a new lichen if it finds a suitable substrate. Unlike with most organisms, if you step on a lichen, you're not killing it, you're helping it to reproduce. Despite this, we don't recommend stepping on lichens. However, over time, lichens have learned not to rely on the randomness of being stepped on. So they've developed little reproductive propagules that contain enough fungus and photobiont green partner to start a new lichen somewhere else. Most of these take one of two forms, either Seridia or Ascidia. So first we're going to look at Seridia, which are little spheres with a clump of green in the middle and an outer layer of fungus, like a chocolate-covered cherry, but green inside. Seridia kind of resemble dust or pollen, but they're not pollen. They're produced inside the lichen, but burst to the surface where they can be blown away by the wind, washed away by the water, or carried off on the bodies of insects or other creatures moving around the environment. Here you can see patches of Seridia along the edges of the lobes of this lichen here. Here are the Seridia coating these pointy structures on the on this cladonia. And here they're forming these little pom-poms on the surface of the lichen. So those are Seridia. Ascidia, on the other hand, are tiny finger-like warts, like little skin tags, that emerge from the upper cortex of the lichen with a lining of algal cells. So here they are, the little fingers, little black dots are the green partner. They're designed to break off easily so they can be transported, much like Seridia. So here you see a bunch of Ascidia along the edges of the lobes of this lichen. It's unusual for a lichen to have both Ascidia and Seridia. In fact, sometimes the way to differentiate two species in the same group is that one will have Ascidia and the other will have Seridia. For purposes of identification, Seridia and Ascidia can usually be seen with the naked eye or a simple magnifying glass. So with these basics, let's take a quick look at 7 of the most diverse lichen groups in the Hopewell Valley. And we'll start with the most diverse, which is Cladonia. Cladonia has 17 species in the area. When you want to find a Cladonia, you generally look down because they like to live either on the ground or on a rotting log lying on the ground. And if you want to study Cladonias, you should expect to spend a lot of time on your hands and knees. These are fruticose lichens. They include our local reindeer lichen, Cladonia subtenuis, which forms these ball-like structures. This is a very common lichen on the sandy soils of the New Jersey pine barrens. Also in this group is Cladonia cristatella, commonly known as the British soldier lichen, because of its distinctive red cap, these caps are actually the apothecia, the fruiting bodies of the lichen. It likes to grow on rotting logs and old fence rails. Cladonia ochrochloria is perhaps the most common member of this group in the region, with these pointy structures that are covered with ceridia. And finally, we have Cladonia grayi, which grows in moss on the ground and forms these cute little goblets. And I'm sorry that there aren't many common names for lichens. Mostly we use the scientific names. They're not like butterflies and flowers and birds where there's a common name for just about everything. A few of them have common names, but mostly not. Especially the next group, Lipraria, which has 7 species in the Hopewell Valley. These are the dust lichens. And they are the crustose growth form, but a subtype of crustose called leprose, as in leprosy. This is because the entire lichen is composed of little granules containing a bit of fungus and a bit of green partner, often tied together by filaments. You often see them forming blue-green patches on trees, as here and here. They're difficult to tell apart based on appearance alone. They usually require some chemical analysis. So if you see a lichen that is blue-green and up close looks like just a bunch of little granules, like dust, it's probably a Lipraria. Telling them apart requires some experience, so I won't bore you with the detailed differences. This one over here, Lipraria finkii, is the most common species, probably because it will grow on bark, rock, or soil. It's named for Bruce Fink, one of the great American lichenologists from a century ago. Also common on trees is Lipraria caesiella, which is usually a bit bluer than the other species. Lipraria normandinoides is a species that grows on rock, and Lipraria neglecta is uncommon, but can be found on either rock or bark. Next, we have the ruffle lichens, also known as Parmotrema, with 6 species in the Hopewell Valley. They are foliose lichens, but they're not as flat as most foliose lichens. They form these ruffled structures, often on twigs. Now, you may look at these pictures and wonder how on earth anyone can tell them apart. This one is Parmotrema subacidiosum. You hear the word subacidiosum and you think of accidia, of course. And it does have these accidia growing along the fringes of the lobes. And it's the only local Parmotrema that has accidia. This one is Parmotrema austrosonensa, which has ceridia along the edges of the lobes. This was long thought to be a southern species, but it has recently been found throughout the mid-Atlantic and has even been found in New York City. This one also has a ceridia, but rather than being spread out along the edges, they're clustered in all of these little pom-poms that you see here. This is Parmotrema reticulatum, probably the second most common of this group in our area. And finally, this one here is Parmotrema hypotropum, which is far and away the most common member of the group in the Hopewell Valley, and is characterized often by having a lot of little hairs that grow out of the edges of the lobes. So that's Parmotrema, the ruffle lichens. The next common group are the Lecanoras, also with 6 species in the Hopewell Valley. Now, these lichens are crustose, and in our area, almost always found growing on bark. They have distinctive-looking apothecia, which have rims. You can see here's an apothecium right here. and it has a rim around the edge, which is the same color as the rest of the lichen. Thus, their common name is rim lichens. This one over here, Lecanora strobilina, is a real weed. It's a weedy lichen found all over tree trunks and twigs in urban and suburban areas, far and away the most common and pollution and disturbance tolerant lichen that we have. This one here, Lecanora hypocarpa, is also common. You might find it on street trees, planted in parking lots at shopping centers or office parks. And it has the most classic Lecanora look with these fruiting bodies, reddish toward the middle with the whitish rim. Sometimes the apothecia, the fruiting bodies, have a thin layer of powder on top that gives them kind of a frosted appearance. That's if you see a lichen like that in our area, it's almost certainly this one, Lecanora subpallens. And finally, there is a whole subgroup of Lecanoras that rarely produce fruiting bodies and commonly look just like a powdery crust, almost like the Laprarias that we saw a couple minutes ago. And many in this subgroup can only be told apart by studying their chemistry. But this one, Lecanora thyssinophora, has this distinctive fibrous edge. You can almost see these little fibers sticking out from the edge, and that makes it quite distinctive. It likes humidity and can commonly be found along stream channels and floodplains. The next group here is Physcia, which also has 6 species in the Hopewell Valley. This group is known as the rosette lichens. They're foliose, and they tend to cling tightly to their substrates. It is also not unusual for them to have fruiting bodies, apothecia. This one up here, Physcia milligrana, is one of the most successful and cosmopolitan lichens in our region. It's most commonly found on bark, but can also colonize a variety of man-made substrates, including metal, paint, and fabric. I've seen this lichen on bridge railings that are metal. I've seen it on abandoned automobiles. I've seen it on tarps. I've seen it on barbecue grills, all kinds of places. This one over here, Physcia thomsoniana, is a member of this group that grows exclusively on rock. You're going to see this lichen on Sourland Mountain on the diabase there. Now, these two down here, it's kind of interesting. This Physcia stellaris and Physcia pumilior, they're impossible to tell apart based on physical characters. They also inhabit exactly the same habitat, which is on branches and twigs up in the forest canopy. The only time you'll encounter these lichens is on branches and twigs that have fallen to the ground. And the only difference between the two is that pumilior contains a single chemical that stellaris does not. So here, chemistry is crucial in being able to tell the difference between the two lichens. Next, we have very colorful Caloplaca, the fire dot lichens, with 4 species in our area. They mostly grow on rock, but if you don't have much rock where you live, some of them are equally happy to live on concrete. And you'll see the one thing they seem to have in common is color, all shades of orange or yellow. The first two, Caloplaca ferocissima and Caloplaca flavovirescens, are the most common lichens found on sidewalks and other concrete surfaces. These fruiting bodies are tiny and can barely be seen with the naked eye. Usually you'll just see a yellow or orange smudge on a concrete surface, and only when you look really closely will you see the apothecia. This one here, Caloplaca flavocitrina, does not produce fruiting bodies at all. This is a sterile crustose lichen. It is often seen as a yellow stain on the mortared walls of older buildings. Finally, we have a Caloplaca subsoluta, which is found more on naturally occurring rocks rather than on concrete. Again, one you're going to find on diabase up on the mountains. The final group to look at will be Xanthoparmelia, which also has 4 species in our area, and here they are. These are foliose lichens, and they live exclusively on rock, Thus, they are called the rock shield lichens. The distinguishing characteristics in this group in our area are twofold. First, does or does not the lichen have ascidia? You may be able to make out that these two down here do have ascidia. You can see the pattern of the ascidia kind of toward the middle of the lichen, and then out toward the edge, there's not much ascidia. Second, is the lower surface of the lichen black or white? Well, you can't tell from these pictures, but I can tell you that the four combinations of these characters define our four local species of Xanthoparmelia. And like the Xanthoria that went into space, these also have a xantho in their name and always look a little bit yellow. These two are a little yellower than these two, but they always have a little bit of a yellow cast to them. So these seven are the most diverse groups in the area. There are a few other common lichens that are not in these groups, but I'll skip over those for now because you've probably had enough. If you really want more, I can recommend this recent field guide by Jessica Allen and James Lendemer, published by Yale University Press. We may not think of ourselves as all that urban right here, but all of our common lichens are in this book. So in the spirit of Ted Chiang's story, The Great Silence, I hope you've taken the parrot's advice and opened your eyes and ears a little bit to some of the overlooked but ever-present world of lichens and what they're trying to tell us. Before I close, though, let's return to Puerto Rico and spend a few more minutes with the parrots and the Arecibo Space Telescope. Ted Chiang published his story in 2016. And as we know, a lot can happen in 10 years. The very next year, in 2017, Puerto Rico fell victim to Hurricane Maria, the most destructive storm ever to hit the island. In fact, the eye of Maria passed directly over the Arecibo telescope. Hurricane Maria really did a number on the Puerto Rican parrots, cutting their already tiny population in half. Many of these parrots were in captive breeding populations and had to be brought into concrete bunkers to protect them, huddling there with the research staff. However, the good news is that the populations are rebounding, and the outlook for the parrots is getting better every day. This shows where hurricanes existed on the timeline. This would be Hurricane Maria here, and you can see the big drop-off. But since then, it's been very strong growth. So the parrots are coming back. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Arecibo Space Telescope. While it was not directly destroyed by Hurricane Maria, it was sufficiently weakened, so weak that a few years later, several supporting cables snapped and the whole thing came crashing down. Subsequently, it was determined that the cost of rebuilding it at 21st century prices would be too great, and so that would be that. There are plans to turn it into an education center, but the telescope itself will never again turn its ear to the heavens. That's a great silence. What do you think? It seems that Ted Chiang's story of parrots and a telescope played out in ways that perhaps the author did not anticipate. And with that, I will close with thanks to Kim Hahn, the Pennington Public Library, for inviting me, and to Laurie Cleveland and the Sauerland Conservancy for co-sponsoring the event. And I would like to thank my partners and colleagues who have supported this research over the years. So at this point, if there are questions in the chat, I think we're ready to move forward with that.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was very fascinating. I didn't realize that lichens mainly had scientific names and not common names. And so, wow. And the great variety in this area. It's remarkable.
Sure.
Yes. We do have some questions. I believe we have two people who asked questions related to the lichen last seen in New Jersey. One asked about when it was last seen, and the other asked the name for it. I think they answered each other. Was it the lungwort? lichen, Dennis?
Yeah, lungwort is one of the lichens that does have a common name. It's lungwort, and the scientific name is Loberia pulmonaria.
Okay.
And as I said, it's been seen only once, way down in South Jersey. I think in Cape May County it was seen, and that was fairly recently. But before that, it had only been seen in I think in 1941, and that was up, I believe, up in Sussex or Warren County, up in the mountains up there.
Okay. Okay. How likely, Dennis, just out of curiosity, that when we come across a lichen, that it's something that could be a very rare one? Because I recently became aware of lichens around the central Pennsylvania area where my in-laws live. And I saw one, I think it was like the red soldier or something like that. My father-in-law told me, and he said, "Oh, this is so rare. We never have these here." Like, how likely is it to stumble upon a great find, I guess, or a rare find?
Well, we did find a new species of lichen up on Mount Rose actually some years ago when we did the Mercer County study. So there was a lichen that was new to science that we found right up, if you know where they built that new PSE&G substation up there, that big thing on the off of Princeton Carter Road. Right behind there on a bit of diabase boulder, there was a lichen that, and I think that lichen has only been seen one other time since then, and somewhere down in Tennessee. So that's a very rare lichen, and it was found right here. So there are rare things that are found locally. Um, the majority of lichens, there's kind of an 80-20 rule, where 20% of the lichens are going to be or say 80% of the lichens you see are going to be 20% of the species, and then the other 20% are all very less common things. So if you find of the 100 species in the Hopewell Valley, you probably got 10 or 15 that are very common, and then the others are not, that you might only see once or twice.
Wow, that's remarkable. Now Gerda wants to know if they damage the living trees, or the ones found in the trees, are they damaging them?
They are not. Lichens generally, unless you're a rock, you have nothing to fear from a lichen, and or even if you're a rock, it takes a very long time. Um, but lichens do need light. They need sunlight, and generally, what happens if you see a lot of lichens growing on a tree, and you're not in like an old growth forest, the likelihood is that the tree is not that healthy. So when a tree is not healthy, then it doesn't leaf out as much, and so more sunlight filters through the tree to the trunk and is able to illuminate the lichens, and the lichens grow more as a result of that. So rather than the lichens causing the tree to be unhealthy, the tree being unhealthy is actually contributing to the growth of the lichens.
Fascinating. Speaking of how harmful lichens can be, we have Sarah who says, "I have a piece of bark with lichen that I've been looking at. Do I need to wash my hands? Is there anything I could be passing on to myself?"
No, not lichens. Lichens are generally pretty harmless. They're not. There's not lichens that you're going to eat that are going to kill you the way some of the mushrooms around here would.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting, Dennis, because I never even thought about eating a lichen, but
Well, the lichens are used in some cuisines. If you go to a South Asian supermarket, if you go to Patel Brothers,
ah,
you're gonna find packages of lichen on the shelf there. There's actually one of the parmatrimas, one of the ruffle lichens is used in South Asian cooking.
oh. You see, my problem is I eat a lot of different Southeast Asian food for my family, but sometimes I don't know what I'm eating. I just know it tastes good. So maybe I have eaten lichen. We'll see. I'll talk to my mother about that. So, Dan wants to know that if what he's seeing on tree trunks in our valley is lichen. It's something black, he says. Dan, I don't know if you want to add more descriptors to that. He says he's been seeing something black covering tree trunks in our valley. Could they be lichen?
If it's black, chances are it is not a lichen. Chances are it is a fungus that is not
Okay.
lichenized.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. Um, I think you mentioned this before. Mickey wants to know if certain lichen prefer certain trees. You've mentioned about how certain lichen prefer just certain substrates in general.
Some of them are not very picky, but there are others that are quite picky. There's a lichen, for example. We don't see it. We don't see it here very much because we don't have Atlantic white cedar in the Hopewell Valley. But if you go down to the Pine Barrens, some of these cedar swamps, there is a yellow, powdery yellow lichen that is on the Atlantic white cedars, and that's really the only tree it will grow on. It's some reason it likes the bark of the Atlantic white cedar and thrives on that bark, but really doesn't want to grow anywhere else. Out on the Jersey Shore, you can sometimes find barnacles, and there's a lichen that grows only on barnacles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Fascinating.
and you will never find that lichen anywhere except on a barnacle.
Okay. All right. Everyone, we have to go out and look, right? Just look in your own backyard, look wherever you travel. Gregory wants to know if lichen can derive nutrients from their substrate in some cases.
As a general rule, most of what they get out of the air. There are, in biology, there are exceptions to almost every rule, and so there are, the pH of the substrate, or in some cases, clearly something like this lichen that grows on the Atlantic white cedar. Why does it like? We don't really understand why it grows there and doesn't really grow elsewhere. May have something to do with the pH of the bark, may have something to do with some chemicals in the bark. So it's possible that there are minute trace items chemicals that it's able to extract from its substrate, but for the most part, not. For the most part, it gets everything it needs out of the air.
Fascinating. Now, Monica has a question about the symbiotic relationship between lichen and fungi. Uh, what are the photosynthesizing organisms that sustain this relationship?
Most of them are some kind of algae. So the green plant is typically an alga. Um, it's interesting in that, as I said earlier, there are about 20,000 types of fungus that are in a lichenized relationship, but there's only maybe a couple hundred partners, green partners, for lichens. So the algae are very promiscuous, um, and will often partner with many different types of fungi. But the fungi are much more selective in terms of who they will partner with. But it's usually an alga, and if it's not that, it's a cyanobacterium.
Okay, okay. And my goodness, there's so many questions, but I think this may be the last one, unless any of you have any other questions. Monica wants to know, after forest fires, do lichens appear as pioneer species?
Um, that's a good question. Actually, I'm going to be doing a little work, hopefully this summer, to try to look at that down in the Pine Barrens. Um, and I don't know what research has actually been done on that. There are lichens that are pretty quick to colonize. So one of the ones we looked at, the Physium milligrana, that thing pops out pretty quickly on different surfaces. But in terms of recolonizing after forest fires, I'm not as familiar with that literature, though I will be by the time I get down to the Pine Barrens this summer, I hope.
Wow. Okay. You have to keep us posted, Dennis.
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, Judy has one more question here. Have any significant changes in lichen been observed and attributed to climate change?
This is a real issue right now, because because the habitat change, uh, for the species that are very, very sensitive to habitat loss. There are a couple of areas right now where in the eastern U.S. where this is an issue. One is uh, along the coast of North Carolina. There are an enormous number of endemic species, lichens that are really found only there. And in many areas of that of Dare County, North Carolina, the land is only a few inches above sea level. So there are huge populations of rare lichens that are potentially could be inundated by salt water and kind of wiped out. So there's work being done to try to figure out how to transplant those lichens um, further inland and further into higher altitude. So maybe we'll be able to save some of them. The other area is in the Appalachians. If some of you may be familiar with the idea of the refugia, but when the glaciers receded, um, they left behind a lot of species uh, that are up at the top of the mountains and are kind of stuck there because the habitat that they are used to is much colder, and so they can't move down the mountain, and they're more or less trapped on the top of the mountain. And those species, obviously, as things get warmer, going to get squeezed more and more, possibly off the top of the mountain if it gets too warm.
Wow. I have one last question for myself, and then I think I would like to turn over, uh, if you don't mind, Dennis, also to Lori. She's been receiving some questions about the trees in the Sourlands after my last question here.
Sure.
Um, in the spirit of Ted Chiang's exhalation, which you've bookmarked your presentation so well with, Dennis, you mentioned that lichens are record keepers of ecological change over the centuries. Now, in a world that moves so fast, what has studying such a slow-growing organism taught you about our own perception of time?
Um, there is, you know, it's that's a good question. There is actually a field of study called lichenometry, and lichenometry is the use of lichens to measure time. And lichens can live a very long time, and they grow very slowly. And as we've seen, a lot of them are quite robust. And sometimes you're looking at a lichen and you wonder, how long has that lichen been there? And sometimes it's been there for maybe hundreds of years. And what they're finding, and this relates back to the question of climate change also, is there are some lichens that grow on rocks that where they've been able to measure the growth rates pretty well. So when you see a lichen of a certain size, think of it sort of like a tree ring. You see a lichen of a certain size, you know how old it is because they grow at a fairly predictable rate. And what happens is as glaciers retreat, you think about a glacier that starts to melt, and as it melts and starts to move up its valley, it uncovers rocks. And those rocks may have been underneath that glacier for millions of years, not exposed to anything outside, not exposed to air. And once they're exposed to the world, then lichens will start to grow on them. And by measuring the size of those lichens, you can determine how long it has been since they were uncovered from the glacier receding. So you can actually track the recession of glaciers by looking at the size of the lichens on the rocks that have been uncovered.
That is amazing. And how we humans figure this out as well to understand our world and the living organisms upon it. That is quite fascinating. Dennis, thank you so much.
Well,
This has
thank you
been,
for inviting me. This is terrific. I really enjoyed reading the Ted Chiang story and found a lot to think about in terms of lichens.
yes, yes. And for those of you who haven't already picked up your copy of Exhalation, the library, we're giving out free copies of Ted Chiang's Exhalation. I think we have about 30 copies left. So feel free to stop by the Pennington Public Library to pick up your copy. We have a number of other programs as part of our initiative that will take place through April 16th, when we'll be interviewing Ted Chiang virtually. If you are interested in these programs, please feel free to visit penningtonlibrary.org to learn more about them. I also wanted to quickly throw this back to Laurie because I know, Laurie, there are questions more about the trees and how people can help in our area, in the Sourland area. Laurie, would you mind just letting us know how we can help really quickly?
Uh, One thing that we all can do is support your local nonprofits that are doing forest restoration work right now. If you have a yard, or if your business has a yard, or even if you have a pot on your patio, if you could just plant native plants, that would really help a lot. We've got 57 state listed threatened and endangered species here, and they could really use food and shelter. So select native plants for your landscaping, put native wildflowers in your flower pot, and definitely come on out for a planting because we'd love to get your hands dirty.
That's wonderful. And thank you again, Laurie. Thank you, Ren, Dennis. It's been great to collaborate with you both, and I look forward to doing so again in the future. So have a great night, everyone, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.